The first
panelists, and then each of them will give a brief presentation, and then after that we'll open it to plenary where you can ask questions. I'll start by introducing Professor Githu Muigai, and I must say that it's very difficult for any student to introduce their professor, especially when the professor is present, and it becomes more difficult when you have to introduce Professor Githu Muigai because he's a professor par excellence, and he's also a legal scholar whose legal career epitomizes all aspects or the full cycle of the legal profession, whether of a legal career, whether you look at it from a geographical point of view, subject matter, or even in terms of functionality. So, Professor, I'll try and do my best. So, Professor Githu Muigai is presently a member of the UN Committee on Business and Human Rights. He's the former immediate Attorney General of the Republic of Kenya, and at a time when Kenya was implementing a new constitution, so a lot of the laws that you see passed through his hands. Before that, he was a judge of the African Court of Human Rights, and before that, he was the UN Special Rapporteur on racism, intolerance, and xenophobia. And before then, he was a commissioner of the Kenya Constitutional Review process in 2000. He has also been in private practice for many years, and he's also a professor of law at the University of Nairobi, and as he told us in the morning, he's going back to teach. But also all of us this session have opportunity to be his students. So he will do the introductory, where he will just speak about the concept of business and human rights and introduce us to that. The next panelist is Senator Mutula Kilonzo, who we're very delighted also to have. He's an advocate, 19 years of practice, and he's a senator for Makueni and a member of the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee for 2 terms now, and also a member of the Senate Committee on Finance and Budget. Then we have Clarice Oganga, who is also an advocate. She is a human rights advisor in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Nairobi. She has previously worked as the Deputy Director, Head of Programs in FIDA Kenya. And she also works on business and human rights with the government of Kenya. Last but not least, we have Mr. Joseph Kibugu, who also has a background in law. He's the Eastern Africa representative on business and human rights at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. His mandate covers Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, and Tanzania. And previously, he has served as the country director for International Justice Mission, and also as an intern at the UN Special Courts for the Sierra Leone. So those are our panelists this morning. Isn't it an eminent panel? Yes, it is. So let's give them a clap. Yeah, so I will invite Professor to set the context.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank our organizers for convening us here today. I'll be very brief in my comments. I was telling my good friend, the Honorable Mutula Kilonzo Jr., His father and I were very good friends, and we worked together for a long time, arguing cases together against each other, working in Parliament on bills and things. He was Minister of Justice, I was Attorney General, and so on. So I was telling him, in view of that relationship, I will donate to him 1 minute, which had been given to me by the organizers. I just wanted to share with you one particular thought that struck me when I was asked to come and make some preliminary remarks. And that is how much international law has changed in my own lifetime and the lifetime of practitioners of my generation. When I came to the University of Nairobi a lifetime ago, our law professor for international law was a Swiss professor called Dietrich Kapler. He had actually been sent to Nairobi not to teach international law, but to teach diplomacy at the Institute of Diplomatic Studies, as it was then called. And Dietrich Kapler didn't have enough work there to take his energies. He was a strong, able man. So he came over to the Faculty of Law, as it was then called, and he taught us international law. So my own understanding of international law as an undergraduate was Swiss. It was a Swiss perspective of international law. And later on, I was shocked when I went to America to discover that the Americans have an entirely different understanding of international law. And I then became a little concerned about how a body of law can have so many perspectives. At that time, there was also a group of emerging scholars from the developing world that was beginning to talk about international law from a developing country's perspective and so on and so forth. But from all that I learned, for example, we spent all our early years learning the distinction between why international law is a discipline about subjects, not objects. And it was, if you wrote in the essays in my third year that human beings are an important aspect of international law, you would have been in the minority and probably in the wrong. We were taught that the essence of international law is to regulate the subjects of international law. And the subjects of international law were A, states, and B, supra-state organizations and so on. So it is such an interesting development for me that we have now moved almost full cycle. And the largest corpus of international law, including the law of human rights, international humanitarian law, and so on, is about the protection of individuals and the protection of the place and humanity of individuals. And that has been very interesting for me. The second evolution that has been very, very interesting is that, and I used to write that about the judiciary in Kenya some time ago. When I was a young scholar, I used to say that the efficiency of the Kenyan judiciary in adjudicating mercantile disputes was always very good. It was very good. The technical capacity of the Kenyan judiciary from the mid-1930s coming this way in adjudicating mercantile controversies was always very good. But it was very, very poor, and it was tone deaf to the question of basic rights, the rights of individuals, including rights to within criminal trials, and these are basic in any judicial system. The judicial system was tone deaf, totally tone deaf. Whether evidence is illegally obtained, whether obtained through torture, coercion, whatever, the system was tone deaf. And we've been evolving. and I think for the better. And I therefore want to close by saying how delightful for a person like me to see our legal system, both international and domestic, begin to treat human rights not as a dirty word, but as an important word to lie side by side with profit, economic growth, economic improvement, social to lie together because they belong together. Because when you have a human rights robust system within a free market economy, then you create a society that is responsive to environment, to health, to labor standards, to cultural standards, and other things that make our societies what we aspire for them. Just, equitable, fair. And I think that the concern of the international human rights community in bringing the business community to sensitize about human rights has been a great victory. If you ask me, this is one of the great victories of international human rights in the last 50 years. And I think that what it has done is made it possible for us to have allies. But I also want to remind you a little something that sometimes in this debate we forget. When we say we want business to be sensitive to human rights, the first thought that comes to you is Kenya breweries, Coca-Cola, BAT, and what have you, and Mutula Kilonzo and company advocates. We want them to treat their staff well. But we forget that government all over the world, but government in Africa is one of the biggest businessmen. If you think of the government in Kenya, the government is a very big businessman. It is the owner of large parastatals. Yeah? The government owns the Kenya ports. It owns Kenya. It owns the railways. It owns the highways. It's a big businessman. So we must remember that we want these standards to be applied to the commercial sector, but also to be applied to government in the commercial sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let's applaud again. Now, I'll invite Senator Mutula Kilonzo.
Thank you. It's still morning. Good morning. When I was young, I had the privilege of going to an inquiry that was called the Goldenberg Inquiry. There was one lawyer, his name is Githu Muigai, then representing Mr. Koinange. I hope you can get clips of the cross-examination of Githu Muigai, because if you want to learn how to be a good litigator, first you will have to look at how he dresses, but more importantly, how he presents his cases. And therefore, it's also a privilege to share a platform with him, a former Attorney General, who we disagreed when he was in business of defending government, and I was in the business of defending the people. And we disagreed on some of the things that he did. But on top of it all is my senior in the profession, and my profession is my first mistress. I don't have another. Clarice was in my class and a classmate, and I'm glad that she's doing well in the portfolio. So I'll be brief. Thank you for inviting me. The problem of being a politician is that you lose your identity. Everybody calls you senator. So what happens when you're not elected? It's far much better for my name to continue to remain Mutula Kilonzo Jr., Senator Makueni, so that then when there's another senator, if God wills, then I don't lose my identity. I was asked to speak about the role of the legislature in safeguarding socio-economic rights. I call them Article 43 rights, ECOSOC. In 2015, Senator Omar Hassan, then Senator Mombasa, who is the former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, and I spent a lot of time attempting to get legislation on this Article 43. And it was extremely difficult to persuade my colleagues in the National Assembly that we needed to find a way of making sure that Article 43 rights are not just rights for the sake of rights. And I will explain why. The Bill of Rights in the Constitution, in order to distinguish these economic rights and those ones, I've said this before, courts have said this before, I repeat it wherever I go, human rights are not given to you. Human rights are yours, inalienable. The purpose of chapter 4 is to protect you, the citizen, from government, where Professor used to work. That's the bottom line. And that is why we have a robust enforcement of fundamental rights in chapter 4. In fact, you can even seek remedy for anticipated violation against the state. That person that Professor talks about, a big businessman, is a bad businessman when it comes to the people. They're very selfish, so you have to be very careful. But what about Article 43? The right to, and when I sometimes speak, I'm told that I criticize people. And let me read this for you and see whether it sounds like the Big Four by President Uhuru, Article 43. Every person has the right to the highest attainable standard of health. Is that in the Big Four? Which includes the right to healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare. B, access to adequate housing. Is that part of Agenda 4? And to reasonable standards of sanitation. Free from hunger, and to have adequate food of acceptable quality. Does that sound like the Big Four? Food security. The right to social security, the right to safe water, the right to education, the right to medical treatment. You shall not be denied emergency medical treatment and social security. The Big Four is Article 43 of the Constitution. Simple, straightforward. The question is, unlike the Bill of Rights, which you can enforce, there are people, the government has denied that there are people who are dying out of hunger. True or not true? But people are dead. What do you do in terms of enforcement? Who do you ask? The Constitution says that you're entitled to the highest attainable standard of health. Who do you ask? So what is our role? In the role of the legislature, our work is to make law. In that law, we're supposed to have laws that will ensure that these things are possible, that these things are attained. And after making law that would ensure that every Kenyan has the highest attainable standard of health, the people who drafted this constitution had very good English. Highest attainable standard of health, not in a private hospital, in a public hospital, using public funds. Accessible and adequate housing. Our work in the legislature is to make sure that these things are possible. How do we do that? One, we pass law. for enforcement. In the Article 43 law that Senator Omar and I proposed, we had a very big dispute among the three commissions. That is the Gender Commission, the Commission on Administrative Justice, and the Kenya National Human Rights Commission. Because we wanted somebody who is in Article 1 as part of the independent commissions to pursue the enforcement. They could not agree. So we thought of collapsing them into one, because it is anticipated in part of the law that the commissions at some point would be merged. The second one, other than making legislation, because Professor will tell you that they can forward legislation. When they want, they will forward. Lots of it. Heaps and heaps of paper. But is that enough? Number two is budget. We have a role, and that is why I sit in the Finance Committee, where we discuss something called division of revenue. Division of revenue, we split money between counties and the national government. In the Constitution, the provisions of how that budget is done, questions of national interest, what constitutes national interest, are all put in there. The question that still remains is whether in our budgets, because we do the budgets, the budgets are not done by the head of state, the budgets are done by parliament. If there's something wrong with the country, the problem is parliament, because they're the ones who do budgets. Do we have budgets for healthcare? Do we have budgets for accessible housing? Do you have budgets for safe water? Do you have budgets for social care? So what is your role as the public? Because when we pass law, we call all of you, even budgets, to give us your views, what we call public participation under Article 10. Do you check whether these things are catered for? Because when we pass law and it becomes an act of parliament, it is assumed by law that you have also accepted and participated. But it concerns me a great deal, both as a legal practitioner, now as a legislature and lawmaker, that we have not found something enforceable about some of these rights. In other jurisdictions, if you are denied medical care, you can sue the state. In other jurisdictions, if you don't get the highest possible standard, not just adequate, you can sue the state, and it can be enforced. My problem is that this part of the Constitution has very little remedy except when it is time to vote out your MP or your government, which in most cases is too late. So the law is back in Parliament on enforcement of these rights, but more importantly, from what the legal practitioners have done and what human rights organizations, civil society, is to start defining these parameters. When we say that a person in Kenya, every Kenyan born in Kenya, should have the highest attainable standard of health care, what does that mean? The other day, Senator Marsabit and a group of people went for a meeting and they were served dirty water. Did you see that on Twitter? Recently, there was a child who was being served dirty water. Did you see that on Twitter? But the Constitution says you're supposed to have clean and safe water. The Nairobi River that passes through your school, somewhere around, behind or in front, is not a river. It's sewer. That's the problem I have with Article 43. That we need as a country to hold government to account. Because this part of Article 43 is the duty of the government of the day. Somebody should be held to account. If one Kenyan dies, somebody should be sanctioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mutula Kilonzo Jr., Senator for Makueni. Yeah, thank you for that presentation. He's following up on what Professor Muigai has said, that government is the biggest commercial entity. So now I will invite Clarice Oganga.
Good morning, everyone. Professor, it's always a pleasure to be in your presence. Mutula Kilonzo Jr., my classmate, we appreciate you. Joe, my colleague. I'm going to speak to you about the role that the office that I work with plays in terms of issues to do with business and human rights. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is a leading UN body that works towards promotion and protection of human rights. Maybe just a bit of clarification, because there's always this confusion about the office and UNHCR. UNHCR works on issues of refugees, and OHCHR, which is Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, works on issues to do with human rights. So they are two different entities, both UN entities, but working on different mandates. As I mentioned, basically our work is to work with different stakeholders to ensure promotion and protection of human rights. So within the UN, we have 3 pillars that the UN works on. We have peace and security, we have development, and human rights is the 3rd pillar of the UN. So our office is to ensure that this pillar finds its space within the work of the UN. The office also works with different experts on human rights. We work with the Human Rights Council. We work with the treaty monitoring bodies. We provide that support to them to ensure that, they work with different states, with different players to ensure promotion and protection of human rights at the national level. In terms of issues to do with business and human rights, one of the key issues that we do is we support the mandate of the working group on business and human rights. Fortunately, in Kenya, we have a member, an African member of this working group. So this working group, basically what it does is they develop guidance and provide, guidance to the UN and to different stakeholders on what to do to ensure that business provides promotion and protection of human rights within their different spheres. So this means providing advice, providing tools, providing, capacity building, providing, providing guidance at the international level, and even pushing to have a binding treaty that looks at promotion and protection of human rights. Currently, we do not have a binding treaty on looking at business and human rights, but we have the UN guiding principles. It's a guiding principle. What we expect is that states will adopt it at the national level, put in place mechanisms to implement that particular document. So it's a guide, but at the national level, states are supposed to put in place mechanisms. So what we do at the national level is we work with the government, we work with the UN, we work with the other stakeholders, including businesses and including civil society, to implement recommendations and concluding observations from the human rights mechanisms. So part of these guiding principles was a recommendation from the UPR process. The UPR process is a process where states, are reviewed against their human rights track record by the Human Rights Council. Human Rights Council made up of member states. So in 2015, Kenya was reviewed at this Human Rights Council during the UPR process, and one of the recommendations was for Kenya to adopt a national action plan that would domesticate, if I can use that word, the UN guiding principles. And there had been a lot of background work to this, because part of what we do as an office is we support the government to prepare reports that they will then use to be reviewed at these various mechanisms. But we also work with the National Human Rights Institution to also prepare its own report, and civil society to prepare its report. Part of the prep work that we do, especially with civil society organizations and the national human rights organizations, is to look at those key recommendations that we would want, the government to put in place measures to implement. So part of what we did is we worked with civil society organizations to look at issues of business and human rights. And this is because quite a number of research had been done by various civil society organizations. If you're here in the morning, you heard what George Kegoro said about, the work that Kenya Human Rights Commission has been doing in terms of looking at issues of business and human rights. So we work with civil society organizations to be very clear in terms of what recommendations they would want to be given to Kenya, as a member state. So part of the work was to ensure that the issue of the UN guiding principle finds its way into the UPR recommendations. So fortunately, in 2015, we had that recommendation coming from Norway. So Norway made a specific recommendation that Kenya must put in place a national action plan to implement the UNGPs. So coming back, once the recommendations were in place, part of what then we do is to support the national stakeholders to prioritize those recommendations and concluding observations from the human rights mechanisms. Luckily and fortunately, which is not the case in some other countries, is that our work has relied a lot on the partnership between the AG's office, even when Professor was the AG then, and with the Department of Justice. We have a very good working relationship with them. So part of what we do is once the recommendations are out, we help them to come up with action plans that reflect the recommendations that they have received, including putting in place timelines and responsibilities of who is supposed to do what. So the Department of Justice put in place this document they call UPR implementation metrics, and they put in place timelines for putting in place a national action plan that would then domesticate the UNGPs. So that is where we are today in terms of that. So far, they have done quite a bit in terms of, following up on that particular recommendation. They set up the National Steering Committee to look at how to put in place this particular document. Fortunately, they've included the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as part of that steering committee. So what we do is we provide advice, and we just provide technical support to this particular process, including bringing examples and best practices from global best practices into this particular process. And last year, we also supported the working group on business and human rights to undertake a mission to Kenya to look at some of the issues that the NAP will be raising. The report is complete from the working group, should be tabled at the Human Rights Council in June. So what we are hoping is that that particular report will also inform this NAP process, because the working group was able to go to various places and engage with various stakeholders who, will be impacted by the NAP. So currently, we are supporting the process. I think there's a draft document, but what we are also doing to support is to engage with businesses. We have had capacity building, because part of the business community feel that this is another form of regulation for them, and they think that there's too much regulation in Kenya. So part of the process is to have conversations with businesses, just to, to give them the business case for complying with the UNGPs. So that has been some of the work that we've been doing with businesses. But also, we've seen quite a bit of interest, when some of the businesses call our office to say, oh, we would want to engage with this particular process. We would want to understand, what the UNGPs are all about. We would want to understand the cost implications and the implications of this on our business. So fortunately, we've had quite a bit of discussion, even on those companies that before were not receptive to these issues. Kakuzi has approached us. We've had a very good relationship with Safaricom, especially looking at issues to do with the data and privacy of data. So in a nutshell, that's how we work. That's how the office works. The office is quite small in Kenya, but what we do is we support national stakeholders, to implement human rights recommendations and to provide technical support, to give them best practices, and just to ensure that whatever the state commits itself to do, then it becomes a national priority and mechanisms are put in place within the state to implement those particular recommendations. So in a nutshell, that is OHCHR for you. If you have further questions, feel free to contact me to give you more information.
Thank you very much, Clarice. She sort of has done a synopsis of what is happening in Kenya as far as business and human rights is concerned. Before I invite Joseph, let me say that for this panel, we had also invited Safaricom. They told us that they were not able to come yesterday, and we had also invited the Office of the Attorney General, Department of Justice. The representative is probably on her way. If she finds us, well and good. If not, we will request Professor Githu Muigai to speak a bit about that, because the process started when he was Attorney General. Joseph.
Good. Thank you, and I will do 5 things. Number 1 is acknowledgement. My work for the last 8 years in the space of business and human rights, whether it is working with civil society organizations, whether it is working with government officials to come up with a national action plan on business and human rights, or whatever I've done, began when I was introduced to a place where I could learn, and that was done by Dr. Faith Kabata. So thank you very much. Senator, we acknowledge your effort. We appreciate your effort. If you've been following what has been going on since Olai case, we know the frustration that those people have had, but we thank you sincerely. The clips of your presentation at the Senate have been going around, and we thank you for your steadfastness in that. Professor Muigai, you are all aware about the UNGPs, and as Clarice has said, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. If you are not, please note somewhere, because you cannot talk about business and human rights without talking about the guiding principles. And Kenya is the first country in Africa that committed to developing a national action plan on business and human rights. And that happened when Professor Muigai was at the office of the Attorney General, was the Attorney General. And that has not happened in other places. So thank you for your leadership. You make us shine and proud when we meet our colleagues from other places. The second thing I want to do is to demystify the question of business and human rights. Yes, we think of tallow, we think of Best Titanium, we think of Safaricom, but also let's think about the small businesses. Last year, you may have heard a case where it was in Nyamakema, one of the restaurants downtown, where a woman who was lactating allegedly was chased out of a restaurant because of what she was doing. And there was an uproar, yeah? Isn't it? Remember that case? That is a business and human rights issue. It's a question of discrimination by businesses. It's a question of how they are treating their customers and those who may have special needs. The other case that I want to mention is we've got nice flowers here. Now, it would be a tragedy if Kenyatta University is championing human rights, but perhaps these flowers have come from a farm that is not paying people well, that is discriminating on women, where women are suffering sexual violence, where they are not given the benefits that our labor laws have given them. So let us move from that top level and think about what is even happening in our places of work, in the places where we, where we deal with these kind of issues. So demystifying business and human rights. I have seen a cleaning service, a company that is doing cleaning services, that has about maybe 50 employees or so, and they are all on contract. And they recently said, we now realize this thing of business and human rights is not, and they said, sio watu wa hao wa human rights. Why? Because some companies have said, if you want business from us, you have to demonstrate that you are treating your workers well. You've got to demonstrate that you are following labor laws. You don't discriminate people because of their ethnicity, because of their sexual orientation, and any other issues. So this is a conversation that we should bring from up at the UN level, which is very important, to the local level. The other thing I want to say, number 3 now, and this goes to Mutula Kilonzo Jr., Senator for Makueni. We have environmental impact assessments. Today, if you want to put even a small building, you are required to do an environmental impact assessment. And that is great. A movement that came the last 20 years ago. And it caught Africa by storm, such that if you go to Zambia or Uganda or Tanzania, you will find this requirement, environmental impact assessment. I am told even in one country, they cut and pasted the provisions of one country and forgot to change the name of the country, and the law appeared in the name of the other country where they did the cut and paste. So that was a movement that happened. My thinking today is that we should begin thinking about mandatory human rights impact assessment that goes beyond the environment. Environment is an important issue. But surely, if when you are putting up a building, you have to answer how you are treating the environment, and you've got to engage the local community. How much more important is it for a big corporation to do a business and to do a human rights impact assessment? So France has led, and it's very progressive piece of legislation. Yes, some more, please. Yes, it's a very important piece of legislation, and it even affects French companies operating abroad. So every year, French companies, okay. Excuse me, we just came from Kwale, and it is, yeah. I am more thirsty than hungry, so indulge me a little bit. So the French law is called devoir de vigilance. So they're saying, for certain companies, they have to do a mandatory due diligence. Even companies operating abroad, every year to demonstrate the things that you're doing, the measures that you are taking to make sure that you do not abuse the rights of communities or workers where you are operating. So for instance, Total, that's the one I can think about, and Orange, they call it Orange, they are required to give that. So why not? Why can't we do that? So perhaps for our lawmakers, this is something that I would seriously say that should be considered. Not for all businesses, but you could say for businesses that have a certain turnover, or businesses that are employing, a certain size of staff. This is something that has to be thought about. My fourth point is the question of government, and Professor has talked about this, public procurement. The government, the state, has the obligation to protect, to respect, and to fulfill human rights. It would be a tragedy, and apart from the Kenyans of this world that are state-owned enterprises, state does a lot of procurement too. Is it at the time that besides asking you as an entrepreneur whether you've got a good tender, also interrogate how you treat your employees? So for instance, if you are if you are, you're doing road construction, or even in IT, I do not know whether human rights is a criteria, but it would be a tragedy if taxpayers' money is used to fund your enterprise. You're getting that business because it's money from government, whether it's from donors or whatever, it's come through government. But also the same government is facilitating, is complicit in your human rights violations. So again, seriously consider whether human rights due diligence should be added to the public procurement laws in this country so that we do not have government using its own money to violate. And the human rights due diligence does not only apply to that entity, it applies to the whole supply chain. So not just state-owned enterprises, but also people who want, groups that want money, business from government. My last point is, because we've got limited time here, if you want more information on business and human rights, there are a lot of resources out there about what is happening in Kenya, what is happening in elsewhere, and we will make sure that that is circulated. We've got a couple of websites, a couple of free newsletters that you people can subscribe to. They are free. You get weekly updates and all that. So you'll be taken care of in that regard. Thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Joseph, for provoking us on a number of issues. But without saying much, let's first again applaud our panelists for very good presentations. Now, I want to open the floor for the plenary session. And what I would request is that we keep our questions brief, probably 1-2 questions at most. And then if you can direct it to the particular panelist, that will be good. So it's now open. I'll take a round of questions, and then the panelists will answer. Then we will see whether we can take another round.
Okay, my first question is directed to Mutula Kilonzo Jr. concerning health. So my question is, the first question is, do the parliamentarians have humanity? Reason being, you hike your health services to go abroad or to go to private hospital and forget the common mwananchi who goes even to the hospital and they lack services. Then secondly, what happened to KEMSA, the one which was distributing medicine to the government hospitals? My second and the last question is to Professor Githu Muigai. But you've said the government is the biggest business person. Do you think it's made up of bad people as the highest percentage? Reason being, the decisions they make our country suffer up to date, and yet the good people who deserve those seats are not given. Thank you.
Another question? Yes, and the panelists are also requesting that you give your name, please.
I am Maureen Washira from Kenyatta University.
There.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Oigo Brian from Kenyatta University. My question goes to Professor Githu Muigai. Having worked in the position of the Attorney General and having said that the government is the big businessman, so is it really fiction to think that we can strike this balance between human rights and business, considering that the government, so in your capacity, is there a collusion between this government and the businesses we have currently? Or is it possible for this implementation to occur, or we are only talking about fiction?
Yeah, I am pleading advance in years. If I take too many questions, I'll forget. First, from the lady there, I understood your question to be whether government is populated by persons who, what's the word? Who ought not to be there because they don't have the best interests of the country and the people. I must say that is a categorical no. I was in government for 7 years, and I met people who I had seen at the university who had never done any other work. We left university on the same day. They went to the civil service, and they work there every day. They work hard. They are committed. They are very, very, very committed to their country. It would be very unfair to say that these people are anything other than patriots. Two, I worked with politicians, many politicians of all manner of description, to the left, to the right, to the center, and others who probably don't identify with those labels. And I am not able to say that I found any of these people to be malicious, to be persons who undermined their country and their people. But I can say this without fear of contradiction. Both the people who work in the public service and the politicians who manage our political affairs reflect on who we are. And there is a sense in which we, the public, expect a miracle that I'm afraid is not available to us. We expect to produce public servants who don't reflect how we live our lives ourselves. Let me give you a little example. We worry every day about corruption and about wastage and pillage of public funds. And we have every right to do so. But we then go back and you find that every village parent is trying to get their child into a school in every other means other than the front door. We find parents have created examination schemes where they steal the exams themselves. It's not kids who steal exams. Yeah? They steal exams for the kids. And then one day they expect that by some magic, this kid who's never done a legitimate exam, who has come to the university with, how many A's do you need these days to come to the university? Whatever. He's never earned any of those for, then he comes to the university and is able to say to the parent, give me my allowance and top up for the guy who writes the essays for me. Let us be serious about the society we want to create. If we want to change our society, that change must start with us. And no amount of bashing the politician. In fact, the guy like my friend Mutula Kilonzo Jr. here, who has stepped forward, is already making a huge sacrifice to be away from other things that would have been probably more materially rewarding, etc., etc. So what's my answer? My answer is there are very, very good people running government, and there are very many people who shouldn't be anywhere near government who are within it, because it reflects who we are. I hope that's an answer that can be of. Do you think I have answered both?
Touch a bit on whether it's possible to implement. He asked, is there collusion between
Okay. All right. Now, the point about government being a big businessman, I think may have been slightly misunderstood. What I intended to say was, if we are trying to advocate the observance of human rights within business, we must remember that government itself is a businessman. And therefore, we should pay as much attention when we talk to Coca-Cola and BAT and Talu and Base Titanium. Don't forget that we must be talking to government as well. Because if government is leading on good labor standards at the ports, or if it is leading on good health standards at the railway, etc., then government is setting the tone. If we don't convert the biggest businessman to respect human rights standards, smaller businessmen will say, you know, we are victims. That's the context in which I used government as a business.
Thank you very much. Since I have the mic here, and since I have anyway, I'll give it to Mutula Kilonzo to answer his question, then I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Maureen. Your question is valid. Unfortunately, I'm one amongst 416 of us, so I can't answer for all of them. What I can say is this. Number one, the budget of health has increased with more than 15 billion shillings from 2013 to date. Budget of health alone. So while it would appear that parliamentarians are enjoying good medical cover, and they do, and they pay for it, whilst the Kenyans are suffering, the correct position is that Parliament has consistently budgeted for a lot of money into the health sector. Number two, the health sector in Kenya receives the highest conditional grants from our partners, donors, and others. Highest is on health. However, you must agree that parliamentarians are not the ones who procured the containers that were 4 million shillings that were found in Mombasa. Members of Parliament were not there. Members of Parliament are not responsible for the pharmaceutical or drugs that are about to expire worth about 2 billion shillings at KEMSA currently. We are also not responsible for paying nurses or paying doctors, or for that matter, procuring the doctors from Cuba or sending others to Cuba. Still not the work of parliamentarians. The problem about the health sector is the enforcement and management of the health sector at both levels of government, because it's a concurrent function. But whilst we are piling money through budget into this sector, it appears to me like we are digging a bigger hole at the bottom. We are doing the business that Professor Githu Muigai is talking about. We are doing business. It's like we are conveyor belt. Sometimes I feel as if the budget policy, budget making, for us members of Parliament is like a conveyor belt for the entrepreneurs and corrupt individuals in this country. Why? Because one of the most controversial things that the government has done is called the medical leasing equipment scheme, where they have procured equipment for hospitals in the whole country. And money has been deducted from these counties since 2013. Now it's 200 million per year. And there are counties that have never opened those equipment. They're still in cartons somewhere. We have passed that law, but they have procured. So the problem is not members who are selfish. They have done their bit. It's only that we have those bad people that Githu Muigai talks about, entrenched in the system like roots, which we need to uproot very quickly before they become a very big tree, which we can't deal with. Thank you.
I will take another round.
This is addressed to the senator. That delay defeats equity, yes? So, Senator, as per what you have said,
Defeats equity.
delay defeats equity. We need to hold people to account. So, who is to be held to account for the number of deaths that are increasing due to hunger in Makueni County? Who is to be held responsible, sir, for the number of deaths across the country due to hunger? And when shall we see these people being brought to book? Sir, very recently we have heard 7 billion being termed as a little money. When shall it be realized that 7 billion is not a little money, and that human rights, this money should be channeled into the right direction for human rights? Thank you, sir. That is my question. My name is Kaunga Chule.
Yeah. We have one question here. Here.
My name is Patrick Lavens, and my question is directed to Mutula Kilonzo Jr., Senator for Makueni County. And it is pegged on two things. One, the Article 43 that you mentioned, and the Big Four. So I will touch on food security and health. So on matters health, if indeed that the health sector receives one of the highest allocation from the government, why is it that it is so hard to stock and equip hospitals like the one at Kenyatta University, which I believe was supposed to be one of the biggest referral hospitals in East and Central Africa, and the Parliamentary Health Committee, which was led by Pasaris, when they came for the visit, one of the recommendations that they had was that the government is supposed to equip and stock that hospital to make it functional. Is it that this money ends up in people's pocket, or we're just so much taken away from issues or from things that will really benefit the locals within that particular area? And just like in your famous speech, the road to Shanghai, which China has, is almost converting this country into one of its provinces. And do you think this is a mess that we can't really get out of? And on matters food security, do you think we will really have enough food to sustain, enough and surplus food to sustain the Kenyan populace if the farmers in Rift Valley are being looked down upon and stolen from by their own representatives? And I think that clip was watched by everyone in this room, that the farmers are really crying that the same people who are really taking advantage of them are the same people that they elected into office. So these farmers end up with their produce stocked, at home, when cartels tend to import food from Uganda and Mexico. So do you think this food security will really be achieved if that's the case in this country? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Abraham Sang, future lecturer, future professor, future senator. So one day, one time, I shall wear all your hats. But nonetheless, I'm in the company of great students and scholars. who is seeking answers to these issues. But I would like to posit a number of questions, 3 of them summarized to the whole panel, and I will leave it to everybody to answer it on a that touched me basis. But first I would like to maybe set the following comments. That number 1, Senator Mutula, I'm glad you talked about Article 43. Of course, the welfare of the people is the supreme law. Professor Gitu, I'm so glad that you talked about the government. Remember that Senator James Orengo said that sometimes government eat its own people. So government can be a bad businessman. The representative from IC, the International Justice Mission, I'm glad you talked about, okay, forgive me, but yeah, of course, the last keynote speaker, you talked about the issue of should we start having due diligence as to companies about human rights. Of course, procedure is the handmaiden of substance. We can never talk about a sensitively justified society without talking about the procedure in which we get things right. So, but then that's now when I posit that, are we simply overstating human rights? Of course, we already have torts whereby we give unliquidated damages for people who have suffered wrong. And aren't we diluting the legal by bringing in this marriage of business and human rights? In addition, I would like to posit the second question. That on, for example, human rights. How then is it important? If we've now gone away from thoughts then, how important is business and human rights? And isn't this conversation irrelevant to the 21st century, whereby the pressing issue is technology and IT? And that's where the conversation should be headed to, as we should be beware of hackers, we should be beware of Facebook. Isn't the conversation supposed to be IT, human rights? Then thirdly, what is the role? What is the role of Parliament to the extent of marrying the domains of law rather than unifying? For example, we have now business and human rights. Should they play a role of making sure that we have solid areas of law, or should amalgamation? For example, now when we amalgamate this way, so that we simply have, for example, a prima facie case. When you go to court, the court can just say, no, this one, you have not adhered to many things, so your case is ruled out. Or should we have solid areas so that the judges will not be confused as to business, human rights, whatever, you know? So I rest my case. Thank you so much.
I want to take one question from the lady there so that I'm also not accused of not being gender balanced, and then we will hear from the panelists, then we'll come and try another round.
Good afternoon. My name is Mariam Jamal, Kenyatta University. With regards to my question, I will give a backstory to it, but first I will state where my issue with business will lie. So, my question is with regards to tourism, business and human rights. Since tourism is one of the major sectors through which Kenya gets money from foreigners, people coming in. So very recently we had a case where a very prominent photographer came in and brought a group of models, and through the services of a local tourism empowering company, they got a group of Maasais to be part of the troupe. And during their photography sessions, they depicted the Maasai culture in a way that was degrading, narrowing them down simply to props for aesthetics for Instagram photos. So my question is posed to, partly to Madam Clarice as well as the Senator. What systems are put in place to ensure that people don't come in and reduce our cultures to mere props for aesthetics? Thank you.
Yeah, let's hear from the panelists, then we'll come back and try a third round. Yes, you could.
Kaunda had a plea as to who should be held responsible for deaths in Makueni. Well, I'm waiting for the details, but I'll answer together with Patrick, who speaks about health and food security. And let me explain how you find who is responsible. There was, and somebody mentioned the challenges we had in Uasin Gishu when we had what is called Senate Mashinani. We formed an ad hoc committee on the importation of maize. We imported over 10 million bags of maize. Part of that maize cannot be consumed because it has expired. But at the same time, when we imported that maize, we imported 10 million, some from Mexico, some from Uganda, but we buy a few bags of maize from the local farmers at a very low cost. The maize that came from Mexico and other places was brought in duty-free. Kenya is said to have lost upwards of 1 billion shillings on tax on that maize alone. And it is also said that we are not certain because there was nobody to monitor where this maize was coming from. It was coming from every place where this maize could come from. I don't know whether some dropped from the air, but responsible. The government formed an interministerial committee of several cabinet secretaries. So who is responsible for hunger? It has to be the same people. It has to be. Because then they imported maize when we didn't need it. There was a bumper harvest in Rift Valley, Bungoma, and other places. But when you have hunger, you're wondering why there is no maize. Food is one of those things that any government anywhere in the world is supposed to provide. The obligation is on government. Simple. Do we have enough food? Yes. I have an instance where in Rift Valley sells a bag of maize for 800 shillings, adds another 100 to buy. That's how cheap a bag of maize is, while people are suffering in Turkana. Some have ended up burning the maize that they are storing because they need to store more for this particular season. So do we have enough food? Yes. But I still think there's some politics about the hunger. Since I was not asked that question, I will not tell you the politics of the hunger. But the bottom line is that when you have a crisis, somebody must go into something we call the consolidated fund, where you must withdraw money. That is the politics of the hunger. So you now know who is responsible. Abraham, the law must always be clear. The law is logic. And the law must be clear. And that is why when I don't know whether you have the subject or legal interpretation, but if you had Githu Muigai in court when he spoke about something called the golden of interpretation, the law must be interpreted in such a manner, in such simple terms, unless that interpretation leads to an absurdity. It can only mean that the law must be clear. So you can't amalgamate. It doesn't matter how many laws you draft, but the law, when the law speak about some of these things, the law must be clear. What we do not have is a robust consumer right protection law as a body of laws, the way you have land laws, the way you have other laws. But we should have a robust system of consumer protection rights laws that would cut across the board. To say that when we imported the maize, the 10 million bags, we had only one expert at one border point to check whether the maize was of good quality.
I'll be very brief because actually the question wasn't directly addressed to me by the learned gentleman. But I thought he had a provocative question. I think at some point he meant it as a way of provoking debate, which is, why are we here talking about business and human rights when there are urgent matters like cyber law and the protection of data systems that are important for getting this country to the next level? I think that's a very, very provocative question, and my only answer is all these initiatives are necessary. In fact, on another day, Madam Dean, we will assemble here to talk about cybersecurity and the law. I am a great advocate of law schools moving forward with what they are teaching. At the University of Nairobi the other day, I participated in a curriculum review where I provoked my old colleagues, a little bit like you are provoking us, by saying 90% of the teachers are teaching yesterday's law, and they are unfamiliar with tomorrow's law, and they are not preparing themselves for tomorrow. And we have a crisis, therefore. So that teachers are teaching what they were taught to a generation that will practice a very different law that is emerging as we go along. So I just wanted to support you that this is an important initiative, but there are many others that we need to carry